Okay, so welcome everybody to Sustainable Food Systems seminar on cell-based meat and the future of food policy and politics. First, I'll begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I'm here in my apartment in Quebec or Brunswick in Melbourne, NAM. And I acknowledge the elders, past, present, and emerging of the Aboriginal people of this land and all over the country, wherever we're beaming out to this lunchtime. Secondly, I'd just like to say we are recording this seminar and we do have it set up as a meeting rather than a webinar. So that means that if you don't want to be recorded, then you should turn your camera off. We'll be mainly focusing on the presentations. We don't intend to be publishing the discussion. So also because it is a meeting rather than a webinar, you have some control over whether you're on mute or not. So please keep yourselves on mute. Please use the chat function to ask questions. You can start putting your questions in during the presentations and we'll have time for discussion after the presentations. You can also raise your hand during the discussion time. This is part of a series of sustainable food systems seminars kindly hosted by the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, and we will be having another one on the 30th of July on regenerative agriculture. So watch out for that one. We'll probably be sending you the advertising. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Robin Warner and Dr. Hope Johnson, who will be presenting our topic for today. So Professor Robin Warner is a professor of meat science and the domain leader for food and nutritional science in the School of Agriculture and Food at University of Melbourne. She's also chair of the Future Food Hallmark Research Initiative, a University of Melbourne funded project applying interdisciplinary approaches to alternative protein, including cultivated meat production. And Robin researches in the area of the sustainability of the future food industry, including packaging intervention, smart packaging, consumer sensory perceptions, as well as fundamental investigation of the biology, biochemistry, and biophysics of muscle and food. So we'll look forward to hearing from her in a moment. We also have with us Dr. Hope Johnson, a senior lecturer in the law school at Queensland University of Technology. Hope researches food and agricultural law, regulation and governance at the international and domestic level. And her recent research has focused on the regulation of novel proteins, which she investigates using socio-legal methods. And her book, International Agriculture Law and Policy, was the first academic monograph to analyse and conceptualise international law as it applies to the whole food system. So welcome, Hope and Robin. The way we're going to proceed is Robin will speak for about 20 minutes, then Hope will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for discussion. So I'll hand over to Robin. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Christine. And I also come to you from Indigenous lands here in Williamstown. So I'll go straight into my presentation. And I really appreciate being asked to present in this seminar series as well. Now, just to check, are my slides looking correct? Great. So I'm going to talk about cell-based meat and future of food. And in terms of the title of the seminar, I'm not experienced in policy or in politics, so I'm more on the science side. So I'll talk about alternative protein production and also some aspects of, I'm going to call it cell-based meat production in my presentation. You'll understand why I'm going to call that I think, in a moment in one of my slides. So I'll go through a few aspects of cell-based meat production. So this is in our Future Food Hallmark Research Initiative. We are looking at alternative sources of proteins and proof of concept products, including algae with Greg Martin in our engineering school, plant-based yogurts with some of our PhD students, blended animal plant products, as well as cell-based meat, which sometimes I will shorten to CB. So the new protein landscape is really interesting. This is a picture of the new protein landscape in 2018. And it's called version 1.3, I'm sorry. So you'll see this box on the top right is called clean protein, which are the companies involved. In the middle here is I've got a box around academia, which is the universities involved. Down the bottom is some of the companies. Quick snapshot of 2018, and remember that picture because now we go to the 2020 picture, version 2.8, just from late last year. And I've got a yellow box around those same boxes in the previous. So now the name clean has changed to cell-based, and you'll see the proliferation in companies involved in cell-based meat, and the proliferation also in companies around plant-based ingredients, etc. Similarly, under research and academia, in this version, Melbourne University appears, and also there's a number of corporate partners. Interestingly enough, some of the big multinational corporations that are producing meat around the world are actually investing in cell-based meat because they see the importance of it for the future. So what and why? What is cell-based meat production? So according to Bowler et al. In a really good publication from the Council of Animal Science and Technology in the USA, cells of animal origin raised in a bioreactor to produce food that closely mimics meat products, traditionally derived from harvesting animals. So why do I use the term cell-based meat production? It's actually aligned to cellular agriculture, which is a broader terminology that's used. And this is the production of agricultural products from cell cultures rather than from whole plants or animals. And I'm going to come back to more on names soon. So in 2021, there's actually now, a year ago, I would have said there was 2 companies in Australia, and in the last year, there's now 4 companies involved in cell-based meat in Australia. And this diagram is from Cellular Agriculture Australia from Bianca Lett. Thank you, Bianca. So a brief history of cell culture, cell-based meat and names. So this is some of the history. 1885 was the first culture of cells from a chicken embryo. Churchill in 1931 said, we shouldn't have to grow a whole chicken. We should be able to grow these tissues separately under suitable medium. NASA back in 2001 was looking at research cultivation of meat from cells. And importantly, in 1962, Hayflick showed that muscle stem cell culture in vitro had a limited lifespan. So this has been one of the challenges in this process right through. So some of the names before 2005, it was called artificial, synthetic, lab meat, or in vitro meat. And then in 2011, Mark Post was calling it cultured or lab-grown meat. Now, in 2013, Mark Post was the first to produce world first to produce a lab-grown burger, which was eaten at a news conference. I'm sure all of those people eating it signed an indemnity. A little bit more on names. So at the top here, we have different companies and people giving different names going forward: cultured, cell-based, which is Memphis Meats, Warner, and others, and also Food Frontiers. I use the term cell-based also in my review because a lot of the words that are used for this product have the C word, as in cultured or cell cultivated. So cell-based is a really good way to call it. For example, and also the name you gave to these products sometimes determined your politics, what company you came from, etc. So in 2016, when Post and New Harvest were calling it cultured, others were calling it clean meat, which didn't stay in population or circulation. It then changed to cultured meat in 2019, and finally to cultivated or cell cultivated was the word that was used by Good Food Institute and others around the world. And that's probably the most common, the two most common names now. A little bit more on that. As we go forward into the future, for example, we think that the consumer-facing products will have unique names, such as the Impossible Burger. And whereas the institutional facing names or institutional facing or regulatory are more likely to use a functional name and likely not to use the word meat, for example, cell cultured product. So now moving forward into how this is actually made, so you understand a bit more about it. So basically, I biopsy at this stage, and this has been done for a number of years. Biopsy is taken from an animal, 0.5 grams, so very small biopsy, would be under local anaesthetic. And then what they do is these little green circles on this photo here are extracted. These are called satellite cells, and they are extracted from the muscle fibre. This is a microscope picture of a muscle fibre, and they're actually ground up, and then they're isolated, and they're selected out and then frozen at -80 degrees Celsius. So the concept being that from a small biopsy, you can actually make 80,000 burger patties. So the concept being a very large production scale. Once you've made these satellite or stem cells, you then have a species relevant cell line established. So you've got these stem cells, you then need to take them through a proliferation, a multiplication stage. So they're actually making lots and lots and lots more cells. And then during that process, and also during the next process, you need to feed and nurture them with growth media. So this is what feeds them in the animal, that they're fed through nutrients in the blood, and obviously oxygen coming through in the blood as well. So when we're growing the cells, we need to feed and nurture them. And this simulates differentiation into a muscle cell or a fat cell or whatever sort of cell we're aiming for. And then there is some form of harvest involved, and then we would go forward and make a cell-based meat product. So there is a number of challenges and opportunities that need R&D as we go towards scale up. Because we can do it at lab scale, but we need to be able to do this at scaled up levels. So I've identified a few different challenges in here, which are numbered 1 to 5. I'm only going to discuss a couple of them in more detail. So one is getting the species relevant cell line. So it has to be optimized for each species. The growth media are certainly challenges. The scaffolding and structure, additives for health, because we have potential to make healthy products from these, and also additives for taste and texture. So going through some of those challenges, when we develop the cell lines, we need cell lines so we don't have to go back to the animal and continually take a new biopsy. We need the cell lines that we develop to have continuous division and to be able to self-renew, which means make themselves over and over again. And this process has to be optimized for each species. So the best system we have at the moment, which has been used for a number of years, is to get these little green blobs in the top picture from muscle cells from mature animals from which we extract these stem or satellite cells. And we know that works. It's worked for a number of years. The limitation with that system is that these cells only have limited division, so they aren't able to eternally divide. So a really big challenge is to then look at what's the other two ways we could actually maybe develop these cell lines. One is from embryonic stem cells, which are much harder to culture. And the other one is to actually genetically engineer them in the lab and have something called induced pluripotent. But then that raises the issue of genetic modification and etc. So do we want that in the system that we are developing for food production? And I'll come back to that later. The next aspect that's a challenge is the growth media. So about a lot of the cost of production is in the growth media, and almost all of that cost is to do with the growth factors. So these growth factors are really important to allow these cells to first proliferate and divide, and then also to differentiate. So the Mark Post burger back in 2013, and I apologise for the different currencies here, but that was how it was presented. It was very expensive. In 2020, a cell-based burger cost about $3,000 per kilogram. Now in Singapore, there is one available on the shelves, in restaurants now, cell-based chicken meat piece at $23 per piece. It's quite a small piece. There's actually loss in income to the company at this price, and they're accepting that at the moment. So moving on to the growth media still, these muscle cell cultures need something called growth factors. So this picture up on the top right is showing to go from a like a stem cell and taking it through the various stages through to what's called an early myotube. You see, you need these growth factors, which are circled. Don't worry about the names, but the point is that these growth factors have traditionally been coming from bovine serum, which is actually very expensive to use, but also in the system that we want going forward, we want it to be animal-free media. And also, ideally, we would like to have what we call clean and green growth factors. So some of the research in our laboratory, for example, is using grass chemicals, which are generally recognised as safe. This is a USA term, such as calcium and also another compound. So can we replace some of these growth factors with these very unusual names, MyoD, etc., with clean green growth factors? And the other challenge is, of course, to do the process without antibiotics. Another challenge is developing a scaffold which is edible and will provide stimulation to the muscle cells to help them to grow, develop and mature. So just going forward now, in terms of the flavour, texture and nutritional profile, this is also a challenge in the production. So I'll just give a little bit more detail on this now. So if we look at some of the plant-based products on the supermarket shelves, the Beyond Meat burger on the left and some minced plant-based 100% plant-based on the right from Woolworths. The one on the left has 21 ingredients, and the one on the right here has 16 ingredients. So essentially, when they are trying to replicate the taste and the texture and to some extent the nutrition of meat patties, it does involve a number of ingredients to try to get to that same taste and texture. But in fact, the products that are now on the shelves really haven't got there yet. And you can see that they look different. The one in the middle is actually made from pure lamb mince. And they cook up differently, so the browning is different. And also when they've been cooked, the interior is also different. So in terms of this taste, one of the questions is what makes the flavour unique for different species and mussels? So for example, with one of my PhD students, Dr. Zita Vaskoska, has been looking at a mussel. We wouldn't normally eat the chick mussel, but it's actually very tasty. And we know that mussels with more type 1 slow twitch muscle fibres, which are the slow twitch endurance mussels, actually have better taste. So it's understanding why that has better taste so that we can then develop it for the cell cultured meat product. This is compared to a mussel from the flank, which has a 100% glycolytic fast twitch fibres, which are our sprinting muscle fibres, and that has a different taste, not necessarily quite as good as the slow twitch muscle fibre mussel. The other challenge is, how do we get our myotubes to grow and develop into mature muscle cells of these distinct fibre types shown here, type 1 and type 2? When we are culturing muscle cells, at this stage, we cannot get them to actually mature into a mature muscle fibre. So that's another challenge that we have in the system. The timescale for products on the shelves is shown here as proposed. So in phase 1, which we're really at now, and we wouldn't have been at this stage last year, we now have products on the shelves where the cultivated cells are used as an ingredient. So if you look at this top picture, this is from Finless Foods, and they've got some little sort of nuggets that they're cooking up here. But at the moment, the products only have about 10 to 20% muscle cells in there, number one, due to the cost, or mainly due to the cost. And so a lot of other fillers and other compounds in there. So these cells are providing, in this, when we're used as an ingredient, providing nutrients and flavour. When we go to phase 2, we would expect there to be products on the shelves which would be composed entirely of cultivated cells. And Mark Post says we shouldn't be producing these products on the left. We should be just aiming for the ones in the middle. And this would mimic current ground meat, hamburgers, sausages, nuggets, etc. So phase 3, much more into the future, is when we would be cultivating tissues of different cell types together, which would likely mimic steaks, whole muscle and fish muscle. I think this area of actually being able to make cultivated meat fish muscle is really interesting and for various aspects, various reasons. So when we think about flavour, texture and nutrition, what % of the product is cultivated meat, cell-based meat? What are the fillers in there? Will this be considered an ultra-processed product, which is in some consumers' minds not positive? Well, we need to make sure we have the fibrous, gummy mouthfeel of meat products. Connective tissue, fat and muscle cells are important. Health and nutrition also important, but I'll talk about that in a moment. And finally, scale up is also an important aspect, but I'm not going to discuss that today. So meat cuts contain many cells. They don't just contain muscle cells. So Mark Post's cell-based meat burger was just muscle cells, whereas there's blood vessels, bone cells, connective tissue and fat cells. And in particular, connective tissue and fat cells both do contribute to the flavour and the texture. The co-culture of cells, fat, muscle, connective tissue, etc., is much harder to do than cultivating individual cells. And that's certainly will be possible in the future. And another aspect is whether we can actually get the cells, say muscle cells, to suspend in a gel and be bioprinted in the future. So some of the drivers for cell-based meat production are shown here. And I'm only going to discuss several of these in more detail. If you're interested in the analysis of the drivers for cell-based meat production, you can go to the review referred to there, or a more brief version of that's in Food Australia last year. So food security, potentially cell-based meat production could be helping to feed the world. Myself and others don't think that cell-based meat production will ever replace animal agriculture, but it will provide additional nutrition, or potentially it will be a niche product, and that might depend on what the price ends up being in terms of dollars per kilogram. Environment and sustainability is a very important driver for cell-based meat production. I'll go into more detail in a moment. There's also the aspect of animal welfare and the ethics of eating animals. So some people choose not to eat meat for this reason, and those who don't eat meat for this reason, some of those have said they will actually consume cell-based meat in the future when it's available. There's public and consumer health and food safety aspects, and also consumer acceptance. So sustainability is really interesting. This is an analysis from Carol Matic in USA from 2015. So she looked at industrial energy usage here, and she's comparing beef, pork, poultry, one in vitro study of cell-based meat, a prior study, and then a second study where she had two different studies she was including. And you'll see that for the cell-based meat, the second study, it's actually has higher industrial energy use than the other meats shown there. In terms of global warming potential, certainly beef is high and pork and poultry are low, but you'll see for the second study that there was a bit higher than the pork and the poultry, but it had a very high standard deviation. So in summary, in this study, now I could have shown you 5 or 8 more studies, and some would say that cell-based meat had higher greenhouse gas emissions potentially, and some would say it has lower greenhouse gas emissions. So overall, in this study, it shows that there's higher water and energy usage, lower greenhouse gas emissions compared to beef, but higher than pork. But importantly, there's a high degree of uncertainty in this life cycle analysis that's been done because the system's not presently scaled up and there's no commercial production. So a number of assumptions are in there. Also, we need to compare to Australian data. So all of these studies around the world aren't on Australian data. And also the existing studies on LCA and greenhouse gas emissions don't include the co-products such as skins, etc. So we do need more data in this area. Moving forward now to public and consumer health and food safety, there's a perceived positive outcome, for example, around the reduced use of antibiotics. And in the future for cell-based meat, certainly potential to be lower, provided aseptic culture conditions can be managed and also antibiotic-free media. Potential for reduced transmission of disease, and this future scenario does assume there's a reduction in animal numbers around the world. Reduced incidence of foodborne disease outbreaks. This is unclear, and again, this will possibly occur if animal numbers decline. And finally, another perceived positive outcome is because we have no slaughter environment, that there's a reduced safety risk, food safety risk. And this is because you'd have a lack of transfer of bacteria from the animal or carcass to the product in the slaughter line. which would certainly be true, but there's a similar risk as traditional meat during the processing and packaging operations. So another one aspect of public and consumer health is our opportunity for personalised nutrition. So what we see with cell-based meat production is the potential to actually make personalised nutrition products targeted for certain demographics. So for example, in this diagram here, a very good article from Phillips in 2012, where he fed either beef or soya protein to older people. And then also they were either just fed and also exercised, which is the two on the right. And he looked at muscle protein synthesis, and you'll see that when you feed beef, you get more muscle protein synthesis compared to when you only feed soya. And when they're fed with protein and exercised, they actually get even better muscle protein synthesis. One of the outcomes of this work is that, and our work is the fact that elderly really need to make sure they eat protein for breakfast, lunch and dinner to either reverse or prevent sarcopenia. So in terms of these cultivated meat products, there is some nutritional analysis required. Let's look at the composition, nutritional value, bioavailability and digestibility. And this will be an important aspect also of regulation and labelling. So will the consumer accept these cell-based meat products? There's a diversity of opinion in the media. And certainly in the media, vegans and vegetarians tend to be overrepresented, but there is a perceived unnaturalness to some extent and risks for human health around these products and uncertainty of price and taste. But if you look at the studies from around the world, and by the way, there's been none done in Australia, US and EU and UK, as well as the last study in India and China, you'll see this shift in people being willing to actually consume cell-based meat products. So when you come to 2019, you'll see that so about 50% of the people that were surveyed actually said they would eat cell-based meat. Now, certainly it's true to say that some consumers may never want to eat cell-based meat products. So just coming to the last of my slides, but it's interesting to think about cell-based meat products. And I think this leads well into Hope's presentation. How will it go through Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, which where it will have to go through, and the regulation aspect. So I'm going to be interested in thinking about soya leg hemoglobin, which is a hemoglobin derived from a bacteria. This is an additive in the Impossible burger, which is a plant-based burger. So obviously the soya leg hemoglobin is also essentially from a plant product, or it's from a bacteria, I'm sorry. So the application was put into Fazan's in March, earlier, and the first call for submissions was in March 2020. So this, and up on the top right, this should say approval report. That should say March 2021, which is when it finally got gazetted, a funny word. And what's interesting is you've got some information here that comes out of the report, so that the soya leg hemoglobin, they did a few different studies, will contribute to the total iron content. But importantly, in the bottom box, you'll see that because soya leg hemoglobin is produced using gene technology, the product, the Impossible burger in Australia, has to be labelled as being produced using GM techniques or gene modification. For the future for cell-based meat production, we do need further R&D in Australia to have a successful Australian industry. If we don't invest in R&D in Australia, we'll be importing these products rather than producing them in Australia. So quite a lot of venture capital investment in cell-based meat production worldwide. There's some identified key priorities in R&D for cell-based meat production. And certainly there's drivers of animal welfare, public health, sustainability. They're clear. We know we also need continuous improvement in traditional agriculture. And finally, I think future cell-based meat R&D will address some of these concerns, but will also require progress in regulation and labelling. And just wanted to thank a few people, Minha, Martin Palmer, Bianca Lair, and also the team at the Hallmark, who have come from a variety of different disciplines, as well as the PhD students who always inspire me in my research and teaching. And I need to stop sharing, don't I?
Thank you so much, Robin. I'll hand over to Hope.
Great, thank you. I'll just get my slides up. Okay, so I'm joining you from Turrbal and Yagara lands, which are also Brisbane. And my name's Hope, and thanks for the introduction, Christine, and thanks to Robin for that excellent presentation, which is always very useful for me to understand the science. And also a thank you to the Future Food Hallmark Research Initiative and the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute as well. I'm not going to be consistent with my terms as Robin was. I'm just going to jump around between lab grown, cell-based, cultured meat, cell cultured meat, novel proteins, but I'm referring to all of the same innovation, same set of technologies, the same product. So the last 6 months in this space, we have seen some significant developments. Firstly, we had December 2020, the Singapore Food Agency approved for sale Eat Just Inc., which is a Silicon Valley-based company's cell-based chicken under the brand name Good Meat, which Robin also briefly referred to. That company's been around since 2011. And from what I can gather, it's sold at an exclusive Cantonese restaurant called Madame Fan. And you can buy it in an Asian salad or in a dumpling or in fried rice. And from what I've read, when you order it, it comes with a pair of 3D glasses and a QR code on the packaging, and you can scan a code and it takes you to a YouTube video that highlights how current chicken production and consumption contributes to deforestation and climate change. And it points to cell cultured chicken as a better next iteration of chicken. We've also had 2 weeks ago a Senate committee at the federal level, so a committee in Australia, parliaments have different committee bodies that are essentially set up by politicians that conduct investigations into different policy issues. One of these committees, the Committee on Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport, announced an inquiry entitled Definitions of Meat and Other Animal Products. And of course, the push for this inquiry was led by a Queensland senator from the National Party called Susan McDonald. The National Party has for several years raised significant concerns about the use of meat and dairy on like and similar terms on alternative proteins or meat analog products. And the concerns from the National Party are of course in sync with this perspective of the grazier industry groups in Australia and the industry media coverage of those particular terms. And this of course is reflective of a much broader debate, a global transnational debate that is led by the grazier industry as well around the definitions of meat and dairy, which have led to certain legal developments in the US and the EU in particular to restrict the use of meat and dairy terms on meat analog products. And I'll take you through the lines of what that inquiry is specifically going to be about in a little bit. Finally, just this week, the Future Meat Technologies, an Israeli company, began operating the largest facility that we know of to date for cell-based meat production, and it is based in Israel. It's aiming to make about 5,000 hamburgers a day, and it's hoping to release its products in the US in 2022. And it claims that its products don't use fetal bovine serum, which is a byproduct from intensive animal agriculture, nor does it use genetic modification. So they're certainly setting themselves up to try and appeal to a large consumer base. And interestingly enough, they're funded by Tyson Foods, obviously a large meat processing company, or in part, they receive some of their funding from there. So how did we get here? And I haven't actually got all of the, I saw that Robin had a few extra companies, so I'm going to have to pay attention to that and update my slide here. But how do we get here? Well, we've had increased media attention and investment in underlying technologies to make meat and dairy products using tissue engineering, synthetic biology techniques, and proponents and developers leverage the issues with intensive animal agriculture, such as high antibiotic use, deforestation, and methane emissions, to position their products and their technologies as the solution. And this has been a very compelling narrative against the backdrop of growing concerns about sustainability and the ethics of food systems. Meanwhile, we've sort of had this innovation system pop up around cell cultured animal products that reflects agricultural biotech more generally. It's increasingly a very privatized innovation network set up by various smaller companies that have as a key asset their patents and trade secrets, so their intellectual property, and of course other sort of aspects to the current legal regulation of cell-based meat is the contract. So if we're thinking about regulation, how it's currently regulated, we're thinking private property rights through the intellectual property regime and contractual rights through different investment agreements and cross-licensing schemes. Now, while the fundamental research in this space has been carried out by public universities, this growth of investment in cell-based and the related technological breakthroughs are wound up in these sort of bigger changes that we've seen in ag science and development around innovation more generally. And that's things like the expansion of intellectual property rights into plant genetic material, the globalization of intellectual property through the World Trade Agreement, which then led to, of course, a more global recognition and expansion of intellectual property rights. We can also see that there's been a privatization of publicly funded research beginning in the 1980s, and that's kind of linked with relative declines in funding to universities and agricultural research and development more generally. These sort of factors and other sort of policy leverages have led to a situation where we have a lot of spin-off companies from publicly funded research, and they have a primary role, these spin-off companies, in the diffusion of biotech and related knowledge. Finally, we've had a deregulation of banking and finance, especially since the 1970s and 1980s, which has been a significant driver in allowing the kinds of investment in these cell-based companies. Previously, it would have been very difficult to invest in a company that actually wasn't producing anything of worth, but just had patents and dreams. But there was a deregulation that allowed for instance, institutional investors to engage in high risk shares. So that's also sort of been part of the landscape for cell-based meat. So my first study in this space was based around these intellectual property dynamics and the broader trajectory with agricultural research and development. And basically how I started was I did a sample of patents in 2019, looking at the European Patent Office's database, which encompasses 80 different countries' patents. And then I cross-checked those with 2 different patent databases. So the Google Patent Search Tool, the US Patent Search Tool, and I used the Trilateral Search Guidebook on Biotech to develop my search terms and sample. From that, I can make some broad observations about what are the dynamics that are emerging in this space and what they mean for the future of the tech and food systems more generally. Firstly, the number of patents filed and published and issued regarding cell-based dramatically increased since 2013, and mostly the patents being applied for and obtained are by private companies in the US. Secondly, numerous patents exist for each step along the way to producing cell cultured meat and for each kind of input required. This means that the methods, knowledge, and technologies used in cell-based production are subject to a very complex network of private property rights. There's also a related lack of transparency in determining the extent of patents available. That's partly because this area draws on, for instance, biomedical research, and it makes it very difficult to find all of the patents that exist around the given methods and inputs. Finally, there's 2 really broad patents in this space that are held by Just Food Inc., which I referred to briefly before. Basically, the patents that they hold cover the fundamental idea of just growing cells and then getting tissue from that and eating it. So they cover sort of the very broad steps in the process, the sort of idea of making it in the lab. And they were the first patents that were ever obtained around cell-based, but they've been extended in duration by Just Inc. And that's not to say that they would be held up in court, but simply that we've got a complex network of patent rights and at least 2 examples of very broad patents kind of covering the field. Collectively, these trends represent an issue for innovation and for corporate consolidation, the latter, corporate consolidation, already being a significant issue in global food systems. It has been empirically shown that for GM plant varieties, the existence of a large number of patents called a patent thicket covering all aspects and incremental improvements of a tech, and leads to cross-cutting licensing agreements, and then eventually leads to corporate mergers, because it becomes a lot easier to merge than to deal with all these sort of different contractual arrangements. This enables a sort of corporate consolidation process and also poses a barrier to entry for those seeking to develop their own cell-based products and their own companies in this space. A related issue is the lack of transparency around the processes, which prevents a democratic deliberation, and ultimately, without that sort of transparency around the processes and the inputs, you could undermine citizen and consumer trust and prevent that kind of civil society and citizen engagement with government processes that inform law and policy. We saw with GM, and there's some suggestion within social science research, that the number of patents around GM food products behind the GM food varieties enabled a lack of transparency, which was one of the factors that fed into consumer distrust of science in this space. So what are some of the options that we could do to address these potential issues? We could look at arguing for more public funding, a public sharing of knowledge and innovation around cell-based. It's already sort of been broadly floated, this idea of a commons for cell-based meat. I think the ship has really sailed on this. If we wanted that to be the case, we probably needed to sort of set that out earlier, but there are examples of eco-patent commons initiatives where you can share environmentally friendly patents in a voluntary manner. I think that the commons approach here is good for innovation in the cell-based space, but it doesn't really address the need to be creating diversity in how we're innovating in ag and food. It doesn't address the fact that there's a lack of investment and support for not capital intensive, for low tech knowledge base or regen ag, or however you want to call it, kind of approaches to agricultural research and development. Certainly there needs to be a push for diversity in what kinds of innovation we're funding. Also, there could be improvements in how we regulate corporate acquisition and mergers more broadly, which could help address the kinds of potential corporate consolidation issues. Finally, I think there's potential to think about what regulatory approaches could do to de-emphasize overly optimistic expectations that investment and intellectual property laws promote or require companies to position themselves as having. So maybe there's a way we can envisage that instead of having to position these technologies as the only solution to complex social environmental issues, we could think about ways that we might reduce the hype a little bit and in turn have a more nuanced discussion about the role of the tech within broader regulatory responses to complex food system issues, such as wealth redistribution and things like that. So that's the current regulation and the issues with the existing regulatory approach. But what can we say about the likely future direction? Well, we already have pre-existing regulatory frameworks for regulating foods produced using novel technologies, including at the international level. We also have statements from the US Department of Ag, and from the Food and Drug Administration in the US about how they plan to regulate it. We have the Singaporean approach that we can look at as well. So we already kind of know roughly how, well, I already kind of know or suspect where the regulatory directions would be heading. So while these processes and issues have these gaps, we can look at these regimes to get an idea of how they'll treat it. In terms of the existing regulatory frameworks, if we look at international law, each country is already limited in terms of how it will respond to cell-based. So Australia and most other countries have agreed to only limit food imports and the flow of food for specific reasons, and provided those reasons are supported by scientific evidence. So when regulating cell-based, most countries will only be able to restrict the sale of cell-based meat to the extent necessary to protect human health, and they cannot maintain those restrictions on sales without sufficient scientific evidence. So Australia and other countries won't be able to deny the sale of cell-based. We could point to the EU and say, but hey, the EU banned the sale of GM, so like, what's the go there? Well, the EU is a very wealthy, one of the biggest trading countries in the world. if they don't want to do something under the World Trade regime, they're one of the few countries who cannot be economically coerced into taking out into what the WTO wants them to do. So probably the EU, the US, and probably China could largely avoid WTO challenges and economic and political implications from restricting the sale of cell-based. But countries like Australia, Canada, Brazil would not be in the same kind of powerful political and economic position. So the categories of likely responses, I think these are broadly where we'll sit. Most countries have pre-market approval processes set up for novel foods. These processes do tend to focus on scientific evidence that's generated by the industry and that is consistent with international food standards and related trade agreements. Cell-cultured animal material as a new food item is likely to be subject to these processes, but ultimately, like I said, they probably won't be denied if there's sufficient scientific evidence that they are currently safe in a toxicity sense, in a carcinogenic sense, etc. So whilst the specifics of the process will differ in terms of the evidence that countries will focus on and the public participation, the overall focus of the regime will be on, is it scientifically safe at present? In Singapore, the process was simply based on scientific evidence provided by Just Inc. There was no public participation process. In the US, they actually don't have a pre-market approval process set up. They're an outlier. Their joint agreement indicates that they probably would have some kind of pre-market approval process, but we don't actually know. They just basically said, in the future, we'll get together as regulators and we'll decide how we're going to respond to cell-based meat. But perhaps that would involve some kind of pre-market approval process. It seems like it likely would. Then we can look at food manufacturing and food and meat processing laws and regulation more generally to get an idea about how regulators might approach cell-based. Just really briefly, there'll probably be some common standards around production and processing. Definitely going to be inspections of facilities. The USDA and the FDA have indicated that they will be inspecting facilities. There'll be some creation of common standards around food labels. Again, the USDA, FDA indicated that they will definitely be having some standards around food labels. We expect to see legal complaints, challenges in this space, shaping the legal responses. And finally, there'll probably be some specific legislative provisions, like maybe it will be a particular offence to pass off cell-based as meat. Maybe there'll be some prohibitions on intermixing, those kinds of clear regulatory responses. In Australia, as Robin pointed out, we know it's going to go through, we suspect it's going to go through the novel food processing laws, a regime that we currently have in place, which will involve a scientific risk assessment and some kind of different rounds of public submissions. And if our food regulator approves the product, they can place particular restrictions on, things like labeling, etc. However, I just briefly wanted to mention the terms of reference for the Senate inquiry, which points to a potentially more restrictive regulatory approach. There can't be direct legal ramifications from this inquiry, it's only political, but the terms of the inquiry do indicate that we could be heading towards a more restrictive approach. Firstly, it seems likely that the inquiry will support the introduction of a standard into the Australian Food Code that prohibits the use of dairy and meat-like terms on plant or cell-based protein. Whether this will go ahead it's super debatable. It all depends on the politics. Secondly, it seems likely that the inquiry will consider potential warning labels on things like synthetic proteins, perhaps around the ultra-processed nature of these food items. I think that the idea of placing a warning label on a cell-cultured meat product or a plant-based product saying it's ultra-processed or not as good as a whole food product would raise international trade issues. And I think it would be very difficult for FSANZ to justify, that's our food regulator, if such a label was to be placed on plant and cultured meat products, but not on, for instance, a packet of potato chips. So depending on how those potato chips were produced. So I think it's going to be very difficult to justify a specific warning label on the basis of the fact that some plant-based products and cell-based products could be ultra-processed, but that's something we can circle back to. But certainly, this idea that we could place a label saying this is not as nutritious as its whole food counterpart You want a consistent approach, and our regime requires a regulator take a consistent approach. And I think it would be difficult to achieve a specific warning label like that. Finally, we can see the inquiry is trying to shape this broader understanding of these products. I think that's really what this is about. It's about, you know, changing or shaping how consumers and citizens perceive these products. And so whether this inquiry is successful will depend on how the public sort of response and understanding of plant-based proteins and cell-based proteins change. Certainly they're trying to, I think, water down optimistic expectations, hype, and the commercial adoption and public support for these kinds of products. So let's see how successful it is. And I'll finish, I won't say anything else, but I will just point out that there's a number of other food policy issues that remain unaddressed by the particular regulatory regime around novel food products, and of course unaddressed by IP laws, as well as the main kind of regulatory framework for cell-based. And so there's a number of other areas where we could be thinking about where regulatory responses fit that are raised by novel protein products or aggravated by the creation of these products. All right, thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Hope and Robin. I think we've had a very thorough tour of the science and the policy implications of cell-based meats. So we do still have about 20 minutes available to us for discussion and questions. And also, I suspect Robin might be interested in engage, also perhaps might have some comments on what Hope had to say too, since Hope went second. So I'll just remind you, you can put up your hand using the little reactions icon down the bottom of your screen, or you can write any questions into the chat. And I'll just change my view so that I can see what's going on. We do already have one question in the chat, which I think I might direct to Robin, at least in the first instance. So the question is, Robin, would cell-based meat avoid what are said to be some of the health concerns that are associated with the consumption of traditional meat? And I guess that means red and processed meat, such as inflammation, increased cancer risk, and so on.
Yes, thanks, Christine, and thanks for the question. Really enjoyed your presentation, Hope, and I was really interested to see the concept that they might label cultivated meat as not good for you or whatever, but we'll come back to, maybe come back to that if we want to. I do want to remind people that cultivated, well, I guess we call it cultivated meat or cell-based meat, but in fact, it's good to remember that it's also seafood. So remember that we have someone who's working on lobster, cultivating lobster cells in Queensland at the university, and the concept of developing seafood products is really good because in fact, seafood muscle cells, fish muscle cells are much easier to keep growing, etc. So just to remind us that seafood and fish are the other ones we can cultivate. So in terms of what your question was, Eugene, really good question. And I just to remember that the data for carcinogenicity is associated with processed meats rather than fresh meats. But I'm going to hand, I'm very lucky to have Anita Lawrence here, and she's going to help me answer that one because she's my nutrition expert. You there, Anita?
All right. Yeah. Hi. Sorry. Just for my camera. Hello, everyone. So yeah, the evidence on red meat and processed meat and cancer, it is stronger for processed meat. So your sausages and yeah, bacon, salamis, that sort of thing. I mean, there is some evidence. If you look at the World Cancer Research Fund, that's sort of the go-to place for the relationship between food and cancer. So in theory, with the cell-based meat, you could actually do research to actually try and change maybe the amounts of heme iron, maybe amounts of fat and protein, so you actually do get a sweet spot where it perhaps does reduce the risk of colorectal cancer. But that would be a massive research project. It's not quite as simple as just bunking some nutrients in and then go, all right, this means you're going to have a low risk of cancer. It's not just the presence of nutrients, it's also the whole food matrix and how they are actually assimilated within the body. And also with nutrition, it's also what you eat, but it's also what you don't eat. Or if you have like the meat with vegetables or with a high fiber. So it's actually whole dietary patterns rather than one single food. But we do know that there is an increased risk, particularly with processed meat and colorectal cancer. So thank you.
Thanks, Anita. That's a bonus, getting a nutritionist in there as well. Thank you. We've got some more questions coming through. So there's one from Simon Newstead for, and maybe this one's more for Hope. What other countries do you think are more advanced down the regulatory approval process? Who's going to come next after Singapore? Any ideas?
I reckon, well, Israel, I think, will be next, but I have trouble accessing Israeli documents. So that it's going to be hard for me to tell, but I think Israel will be next off the track. And I don't think the US will be too far away either. So hopefully we can see some developments there as well. Thanks, Simon.
Robin? Yeah.
Just very quickly on that, and it's a great question because it would have been very easy for the big meat groups in USA to block this all, and then really the whatever the cattle group's called in USA, I can't remember the name now. They really got together with a lot of the companies who were involved in this because I recognised that if they made it too hard, it was going to happen anyway, and it was going to actually really impact on the companies in Australia, in the development industry, in the USA and around the world. So they came to an agreement, which was really interesting because they were starting to block it a lot, the animal agriculture industries. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it. I've seen the opinion put that, Singapore and Israel are the front runners for the food security sort of reason, because they're small countries that, well, particularly Singapore, obviously it doesn't produce much of its own food. It's put a lot of investment into producing food via technology, and Israel the same, have also put a lot of money into technology. And I thought it was interesting the comment that Hope made about whether these technologies are privately owned or publicly owned. And I'd sort of had the impression from like Singapore and Israel that there was a public ownership. And I like, Robin, the way that you framed it, that Australia really does need to invest in this, otherwise we'll be importing these products. And I was actually curious, I guess, from Robin's end, like what you thought of Hope's comments about whether these technologies should be like a commons or have more public investment and be a bit more open access, like we've been talking about with data and so on. I don't know if that's something you've thought about or not.
I have, and I've read the papers on this, and really there's a corporatization versus what we call the distributed model. And in fact, I think in my review I briefly referred to this because there's one, I guess it's an aspirational concept, or it would be good if it was more publicly available, so even farmers in remote areas could get, these cell-based meat, small companies in remote areas could actually be involved in, get these cells in and then have their little production facility very locally. It may be aspirational because there's a lot of corporate companies involved at the moment, but that would be, I mean, from my point of view, it'd be really good because, and the ultra processing, I think we need to remind ourselves that ultra processing isn't actually bad. There is a perception that it's bad. I mean, there's some people who want whole foods and they want to just, eat, let's say, a soybean whole or whatever, but ultra processed is not necessarily bad. So we need to remind ourselves of that, and also help to educate the consumer on that. maybe more debate on it as well.
Well, that leads nicely into a question from Radhika, and there might be other questions or opinions out there as well on ultra processed. So Radhika asks, Hope, interesting how you made that analysis of alternative protein being labelled ultra processed. How much will this affect consumer acceptance? And will this be a strict compliance label that companies would have to comply with?
Yeah, I think this ultra processed debate that has been triggered in the public and in our regulatory minds in regulatory spaces around cell-based and plant-based, there is a need for a broader discussion around our need to be promoting the consumption of fruit and vegetables in Australia, first and foremost. And the overconsumption of ultra-processed food as a category of food items in Australia has been problematized by the CSIRO and by public health nutritionists. And the concern is that when you have something that is using lots of different additives and lots of different removed ingredients and putting them all together, there's often added sodium or added sugar, or even if there isn't, they're just not as desirable of a food item, or they're just not as nutritious as something else that you could be eating. And the whole food matrix, as Anita referred to. So I think there is a concern around the ultra processed nature of food more generally that I wish we were having a conversation about, instead of focusing on whether plant-based and cell-based are ultra processed as such. I think that suits political arguments and not an argument around public health and how we can best meet public health requirements. So I think it would, I think framing plant-based and cell-based as ultra-processed would affect consumer acceptance, because all the studies show that we have this innate yuck factor around things that seem artificial. There was the whole Frankenfoods, the use of that kind of discourse to capture and influence minds during different GM debates. So studies do suggest that consumers will be put off by the artificial seeming nature and sort of a natural fallacy that natural produced stuff is always safer and better. And so I think it would affect it if you had something that said, this is an ultra processed product, or just so you know, this is not the whole food product, because we have this idea around whole foods and clean eating and stuff like that. But I don't think that Australia will move to make it a strict compliance requirement, because I think it'll be a breach of our World Trade obligations anyway. But I also think that it would be very difficult to justify, at least under our current regulatory regime, having such labels. But maybe things can change. Yeah.
Thanks, Hope. Can I make a comment here? I think there's a couple of aspects to this. One is that some of the foods we eat now, which are very processed, but the other aspect to it is, if we think about the greenhouse gas emissions, it's really interesting. There's been some great analysis done by the CSIRO group and Brad Ridout. And in fact, discretionary foods, which are the foods we actually don't need, but they're in that healthy, that pyramid, is it the pyramid? I think it's a circle. Discretionary foods are off to the side, and they actually have very high greenhouse gas emissions, and we forget to talk about those. So the foods we don't need to eat, like chips, meat pies, I love meat pie, etc., alcohol. Yeah. And the other comparison they've done is an unhealthy diet compared to a healthy diet. Again, the unhealthy diet uses more water. There's water use, and I think it's a more complex debate around discretionary foods and unhealthy versus healthy. We're happy to talk about, not eating maybe meat or cell-based meat or whatever, but then we don't want to talk about giving up our meat pie or our chips, I think. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. That was what I wanted to say. Thanks, Hope and Christine.
Thanks. Yeah, really interesting discussion. So we've got a couple more questions coming in. So there's, I think, another one that I'll ping to Hope first up. The European Union, so this is from Rosita, the European Union has revoked its proposal to ban dairy designations on plant-based products. It seems there's a lot of political pressure in the area. What's Hope's view in terms of the chances of protecting meat and dairy designations in Australia?
Yeah, I think in Australia, we have a particular political climate where we don't have a lot of startup companies here that are making the product, unlike the US. our big meat processing companies are not based here, unlike in the US, the ones who are investing in plant cell-based. But what we do have is a very strong grazier industry, large export industry based around agriculture. So I think there's a higher chance of us having meat and dairy specific laws and restrictions than perhaps if you look at the political, sort of groups and where power lies in the US. So, and we also have the National Party, which is, a closely associated with farming lobby groups, which is also a distinct feature of the Australian political landscape. So I think we have a much higher chance of having protective laws around meat and dairy than another country would. Yes. Yeah.
Sorry. Thanks, Hope. Did you want to add anything, Robin, on that point? No, she's right. So I've got a question from Sophie. Sophie, did you want to ask your question in person, or are you happy for me to read it out?
Okay, that's fine. Hello. Sorry, I don't have video because my laptop's shut, so just listen to me. I'm just curious, I think sometimes when you're talking about this thing about ultra-processed foods and, public health nutrition, we're sort of having a pretty academic conversation, assuming that that's how people eat. But we know that fast food is wildly successful and people don't really give a damn about dietary advice in their real lives. Once this just becomes ubiquitous, like we're definitely seeing with some of the plant-based protein meat alternatives already, players like Hungry Jack's moving into funding, and I went to a presentation last year about, someone had successfully basically synthesized like a prawn dumpling filling. Once we sort of move into these foods that don't look like meat anyway and just become ubiquitous because they're being pushed out with marketing by big food corporations, do you think that's really going to change the regulatory environment and the consumer acceptance around what we're talking about, rather than does this look like a steak and is Barbie Joyce pissed off?
I think in terms of the actual taste and texture, when we go to fast food chains, my colleagues say that it's all in the sauce. So in fact, when it's in a fast food chain, I must say the issues of the taste and the texture, they're much more disguised. But in terms of regulation, I'm going to, it's not as important when you've got a burger bun with lots of sauces and everything else. But I'm not as clear on the regulation side, of course, because that's Hope's and Christine's area. Thanks.
Yeah, so do you mean, Sophie, like because our food is already so removed from nature and whole food, especially when you're eating it in those fast food climates, like in this fast food context, like it doesn't really matter either way because it's already by that point such an, ultra processed food item that we're eating. So what is it even, why are we even discussing which one's healthier and which one's not?
A little bit of that, but I think also like there is this sort of like there's two steps of what you're eating or whatever that we know that fast food or global corporations, whether it's like Nestle or something like McDonald's or Hungry Jack's, whatever, they're really good at marketing stuff, and there's a lot less, I guess, like the concept of like neophobia about trying new foods. Like as you say, Robin, if it's like I don't know, what's a Hungry Jack's burger called, like a Whopper or whatever. If it's one thing or the other, it sort of takes away that neophobia. So it takes away a lot of the consumer criticality and just says, oh, it's another burger. Yeah. I just wonder sort of what the regulatory potential is to sneak in a lot of public acceptance via these things that actually take away a lot of that abject feeling you get from going, oh, this steak doesn't really look like a steak, this prawn doesn't really look like a prawn. But it's a lot easier to go, oh, that was an okay prawn-ish dumpling and that was an okay meat-ish burger.
Yeah.
And then with the money that's behind these corporations, like how does that really kind of play into the regulatory environment we're discussing?
Yeah, and maybe it's already happened because, I tried the beef burger from Hungry Jack's, the Rebel Whopper, and it was seemingly on par with a Whopper because they were already both so far removed from, a whole food item anyway.
It tastes like salt. It's like great.
Yeah, and the standard, and so I think you're 100% right that actually it's already begun. And that the way to change people's minds around it is through the fast food, where we already have particular cultures around food that can be used to support these new items.
And the other comment I'd make, thanks Hope, the other comment I'd make is that if we were wanting to increase consumer acceptance, because we've done this with, or increase consumer awareness, we've done this with other products that we've worked with, is we'd actually engage with chefs and also get it, I think if we wanted to promote it, if companies wanted to, so you get chefs to develop products with it and get it more known, and then maybe getting into restaurants, sorry, that's probably the word I'm thinking of, because if you try it in a restaurant and you go, oh, that's interesting, you might then go and try it at home. Can I just, sorry, do you mind if I ask about the ultra processing, Christine? Georgi, I think you're probably, or Rachel, did you want to comment on ultra processing? I did ask Georgi, but maybe he's stepped away from his microphone, or Rachel, did you want to comment on ultra processing? No, neither of them's answering.
Sorry, Robin, I wasn't expecting you to jump in there. I can comment on ultra processing.
Just to help people, Georgi's also in the hallmark, as is Anita, so it's good to have them here. And
did you mean in terms of, it's funny, the ultra processing terms particularly being used in terms of the plant-based meats rather than the cell-based meats?
Oh, yeah.
I think the cell-based meats is a really interesting question, because it actually, the whole nature of this technology, it transcends the whole distinction between agriculture and food processing. It's hard to know where to fit it in. But the plant-based products are clearly ultra-processed by the technical definition of the term, which is not necessarily widely accepted, that framing, that ultra-processed framing, but it is increasingly within the nutrition science community. So I'm not sure what question you have beyond that, but it's certainly, there's no question that it is ultra-processed.
Yeah, I found it interesting the inquiry put them both as ultra-processed. I mean, it would, but it painted them both as ultra-processed. But I think,
really?
Yeah, but I think it's more debatable that whether cell-based is ultra-processed or not.
Yeah, at the moment, the Nova ultra-processed framework would not consider those processing techniques. It haven't considered them yet to include them.
But I wonder if you look at the processing techniques that they do consider in that Nova category, I think they would consider cell-based to be ultra-processed.
And I work with this team. I think they probably just haven't. They're certainly critical of the plant-based processed foods, but I don't think they're necessarily yet got to the point of evaluating those processing techniques. It's more a focus on ingredients that have been further processed and additives. I guess it's hard to know what these products will actually look like when the time comes.
Yeah.
I might jump in there. I mean, I thought it was interesting, Robin, in the sort of phases that you went through. You sort of had that first phase was where there were just a few of the cell cultured ingredient in what would essentially be a processed food of some description. So it may be that in practice at the beginning, at least, it's not necessarily that the ingredient itself would count as ultra processed, but it may well be used in processed or ultra processed foods. So much of our ideal might be something different. The practical reality could be that those ingredients are used in processed foods. But I think maybe we should move on. There's one last question there. Actually, we're past our time. Yeah, yes.
Two questions. There's two questions.
There, I think there's one comment and one question.
Okay, yeah.
I might just pose that last question and then we'll close off. So from Carla, we currently use about 40 to 50% of land for agriculture, of which 60 to 70% is used to support animals. This is a huge spatial footprint and has major consequences. Even if water usage could be improved, Robin, do you think the spatial footprint of cell culture is beneficial? That's a good question.
I think spatially, yeah, very good question. Spatially, yeah, definitely. But again, we need this data done in Australia. There's again a very good, it's called cropland footprint, I think it's called. It's another paper produced by the Brad Ridout Group. So this whole thing about land footprint, preservation of natural resources. I forget the term for that. Someone remember water footprint, nitrogen footprint. We tend to just talk about greenhouse gas emissions. So Potentially, yes, but remembering that sometimes our animals are grazing on land that couldn't be used for anything else, or it could be used for native bush, of course, couldn't it? So this is that whole thing about the land footprint is a really important part of the equation, and preserving our natural resources that we need to definitely consider. But from what I understand from the people who work in this area, it's probably, to be honest, I mean, we've still got more of our resources, for example, natural resources compared to Europe, because they chopped theirs down however long ago. Brazil's still chopping theirs down. That issue of land footprint is really important as well, definitely. So cell culture will be a much smaller footprint, but I think water and nutrients, and where the nutrients are coming from, as well as greenhouse gas emissions, and whether the energy production is decarbonised. So I've read a paper, the same Carol Mattock said, cell culture, which will require a lot of energy, because remember the animal normally does it all naturally. You need energy inputs to do a lot of those processes. Unless energy is decarbonised, it's not going to be, she thought, better for greenhouse gas emissions. I hope that answered your question.
That was a great summary. Well, I think we better close it off there, as we have even gone a wee bit over time, but there's so many fascinating issues to discuss, with the possibility of cell-based meat already here, and potentially expanding into the future. I just want to thank Hope and Robin for sharing their expertise with us, and also Astari from the Centre for Environmental Law, who set everything up for us. Thanks, Astari. And thank you to all our attendants for coming along and asking great questions. And we have recorded the presentations, and they'll be available via the Missy website, and probably the Future Food website in due course. Thank you.